Back at the turn of the millennium, wrestling was on fire to such a level that the top two promotions couldn't just have one weekly TV show each. No, they had to have two. And for the WWE side of the equation, this second show would end up being one which was called SmackDown. How would SmackDown fare initially, and where has it gone since those early days? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now in the entire history of SmackDown. Back in the late 90s, wrestling reached mainstream levels of success it had never achieved before, not even during the 80s when Hulk Hogan was at his peak. And with there being two powerhouses during this period in WWF and WCW, it was inevitable that both were going to start expanding to even greater degrees before long. Who would do this first? Well, it would be World Championship Wrestling, who first introduced their secondary show, Thunder, in January of 1998. A show which met with much success for the company during those early days at least. So, not wanting to waste any more time encountering, Vince McMahon would work with the UPN network to bring his own B show to life in April of 1999 when they introduced the world to their newest creation, SmackDown. Of course, during that initial episode, it wasn't a guarantee that SmackDown was going to become a weekly show. No, this was very much considered a pilot, with there being a possibility of more if it happened to be a success. Luckily then, the show was a success, with the big takeaway storyline-wise from that debut being the formation of the corporate ministry, the most unholy corporate merger of all time. That said, it wasn't just the antics of The Undertaker, Shane McMahon, and other heels which made this one worth watching. No, the real star of the show on that night was the man SmackDown had been named after. That's right, so white hot was The Rock come the spring of 1999, one of his catchphrases would be used as the name for this event. It would be like if WWE introduced a new show today and called it Oola Fala. And when SmackDown was commissioned as a full-time weekly series soon thereafter, and began airing as such a few months later in August, this would be the name which would remain associated with it. Obviously then, Dwayne Johnson would be all over those early shows, but he wasn't all there was, as looking to establish this as more than just a B show, WWF would throw all their stars on those initial episodes of the Blue brand. We're talking about people like Mick Foley, Triple H, Chris Jericho, and of course Stone Cold Steve Austin here. And that was a smart move as it happened because during those initial years, SmackDown had a big advantage over Raw in the fact that it was on network TV, meaning it was available to watch to a much wider audience than Raw was on cable. Yes, UPN and USA had a big difference in reach. So this meant, in theory, more people would be watching the Blue brand every week than they would the Red one. As you would imagine then, there were a lot of things which happened on Thursday nights at this point, things such as Vince McMahon infamously winning the WWF title from Triple H that September, or perhaps the only buried alive match ever given away on weekly TV. Really, it was more of an extension of what was happening on Monday nights rather than a separate show, and that helped to make it just as much see as Raw. That said, it wasn't like SmackDown didn't have some struggles during those early days. After all, mere months after it debuted and was still trying to establish itself, the top star in the company, Steve Austin, would have to take a year out of the ring to go get neck surgery. Thankfully though, while this could have been a complete disaster, the roster was so strong back then that his absence was barely felt. And that was still true as 2000 rolled around and the work rate half of the Attitude Era began, with the introduction of people like Kurt Angle, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and more. Hell, when the Radicals made their shocking jump from WCW in January of 2000, it would be on SmackDown, not Raw, in which they had their debut matches with WWF, a sign of just how much weight Vince McMahon was putting behind this secondary show. And it would also be on SmackDown that plenty of other iconic moments occurred throughout that year, moments like Mick Foley's transformation into Cactus Jack, Steve Austin briefly returning to blow up the DX Express, and The Rock doing his famous sliding people's elbow. Then there's the fact that so much of the McMahon-Helmsley era, which dominated a lot of WWF TV at the start of the millennium, would take place on the Blue brand, with it being there that both Triple H beat the Big Show for the WWF title, and Stephanie McMahon beat Jacqueline for the WWF Women's title. Needless to say then, as a counter to Thunder, this was a very successful experiment for WWF. And as a show which could stand right out there alongside Raw in terms of importance, it was even more successful. And that was all evidenced when, once WCW went under in 2001 and was bought out by Vince McMahon for pennies on the dollar, the Blue brand remained a key part of storyline advancement in WWF all throughout the Invasion angle. Hell, sometimes it would get bigger moments than the Red brand did. After all, how can we forget about the segment prior to Invasion in which the old Stone Cold returned? That all happened on SmackDown, as did the famous supermarket brawl between Steve Austin and Booker T. And as if that wasn't enough, it would be SmackDown which hosted the first live sports broadcast held in America after the events of 9/11, with this episode seeing the entire roster come out and stand together, heel and babyface alike, as they helped the nation to heal with 2 hours of entertainment. Sure, the fact this happened on the blue brand rather than the red one was more circumstantial than anything, but it certainly helped to add to the idea that what was taking place on Thursday nights was far more than just shoulder programming like Sunday Night Heat or Shotgun Saturday Night had been before it. But for all the early success SmackDown was having, it wasn't immune to having the format thrown out and things reworked in an all-new way, as come early 2002 there would be a big change in the air. Why was that? Well, this was the point where, realizing that them no longer having any competition was having a negative effect on their business, WWE decided to try and manufacture their own internal competitor. Yes, this was the point where Raw and SmackDown were split up and were given 2 separate rosters, with the idea here being that going forward, each show would have a unique writing team and would be fighting for supremacy over the other in the weekly ratings, just as Raw and Nitro had once been doing the same. Obviously then, this lit a fire under those who were in charge of the blue brand, namely Paul Heyman and Stephanie McMahon, to succeed at a higher level than the red brand. And it led to what many people consider to this day to be the golden era of SmackDown. What made this era so special? Well, while Raw was being crushed under the boot of Triple H's reign of terror, all while it was simultaneously trying to live off of the fumes of the Attitude Era with infamous moments like the HLA segment or the Katie Vick angle, the blue brand was going in a different direction altogether. Sure, it wasn't like there were none of the goofier moments to be found on SmackDown at all. No, segments like Billy and Chuck's wedding or the Tori Wilson, Dawn Marie, Al Wilson love triangle certainly had plenty of that. But back then, the show was a lot more focused on great in-ring wrestling above all else. Basically, this is what ECW would have looked like if it had lived on into the mid-2000s, something Paul Heyman has alluded to in the past when he said he imagined the Philly promotion morphing into something more akin to early Ring of Honor, where it would have been all about work rate rather than the same shock tactics which got over during the late 90s. And this was certainly a move which was well received by fans, as with the SmackDown 6 at the helm, Thursday nights largely became seen as the must-see night to tune into WWE, far more so than the flagship for a while. Who were the SmackDown 6? Well, they'd be made up of Kurt Angle, Chris Benoit, Edge, Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, and Chavo Guerrero, a sextet of the best workers in the world back at that point in time. So as you would expect then, no matter which combination any of these 6 were put in over the next couple of years, whether it be trios, tag, triple threat, or singles action, they always delivered to the point that they soon became synonymous with the quality of the brand overall. But they weren't the only big names SmackDown had during the early days of the brand extension. No, there was also another major player to be found in none other than Brock Lesnar. Hell, it was Brock who ended up becoming the first blue brand exclusive world champion when he brought the undisputed title to SmackDown full-time in the autumn of 2002 after winning it from The Rock. And it was him who would go on to have a series of classic matches over that belt with Kurt Angle, with one of these matches, their 1-hour Iron Man bout on the September 18th episode of the Blue Brand, still being amongst the best WWE has ever given away on free TV, even to this day. But that wasn't the only great SmackDown moment Lesnar was involved in during those early days. No, there was also the time he and The Big Show quite literally destroyed the ring during a famous segment which caused their match to end early, a segment which still gets regularly replayed in retrospectives to this day. And then there was the feud he had with the other great mainstay of the blue brand during this era, the dead man himself, The Undertaker. That's right, so synonymous with SmackDown would Mark Calaway become here, so much a part of its DNA would he transform into, it became a full-blown meme after a while that whenever general manager Teddy Long wasn't putting people in tag team matches playa, he was having them go one-on-one with The Undertaker. That said, for as big as the Phenom was during the early to mid-2000s, he wasn't quite as beloved as Eddie Guerrero was. No, after coming back from the absolute brink of addiction, then beating the Beast for the WWE title at No Way Out in February of 2004, Eddie would return to his home of the Blue Brand as a conquering hero and a true bastion of everything which was making that brand so special. Not just the level of in-ring skill its performers had, but also the personality they exuded. Basically, what we're saying here is that it was almost universally agreed during this early to mid-2000s run that SmackDown was the best thing WWE had to offer. But for as great as it was, more changes were coming soon anyway. And the reason for that was because a whole new generation was about to rise to the top, something which would become evident on the night where a young performer named John Cena made his debut on the Blue Brand to challenge Kurt Angle. Fast forward to a couple of years after that, and Cena would be en route to becoming the biggest star in the entire industry, something he was doing by rising up the ranks of SmackDown as United States Champion and fending off the challenges of people like Carlito. Sure, once he actually won the WWE title from JBL at WrestleMania 21, he'd be moved over to Raw not long thereafter. But it wasn't like the Blue Brand didn't get a pretty decent make-good here, as in exchange they got the World Heavyweight Champion, Batista. And this then would formally start the whole new era of SmackDown, one in which both Batista and Edge would serve as its top acts, as by that point, the Rated R Superstar had also struck gold with his new cocky heel gimmick. Hell, each of these men would largely remain a part of Thursday nights all the way up until their respective exits in 2010 and 2011. That said, even with their star power leading the charge, it didn't take long for it to become apparent that this was the point the Blue Brand was truly slipping into Beast Show territory for the first time. Something which should have been evident as soon as the new franchise player was moved off of that show and over to the flagship almost as soon as he won the Big Boy belt. Come on now, the fact that SmackDown got the World Heavyweight title instead of the WWE title was, in hindsight, a sign of how it was slipping in importance as a brand here, because while both belts were, in theory, on the same level, everyone knew that the real world champion was the one over on Raw, as that was the one with the lineage going all the way back to George Hackenschmidt. It didn't matter if Booker T managed to have a great run with it as King Booker. It didn't matter if The Undertaker made it his own for a while. The World Heavyweight title was by then less a true top prize and more what the Intercontinental title had been back in the 80s, a high-level secondary piece of hardware. How would SmackDown try to get some of its momentum back now that this had firmly established them as the B brand? Well, the addition of up-and-coming names like CM Punk were one way, as during his Blue Brand feud with Jeff Hardy in the late 2000s, he really showed he could rise to the occasion. But as was becoming the case so often by then, this success only saw him eventually be moved over to the real A show, Raw. Honestly, there was a point here where as the 2010s arrived, it had never felt less important to tune in to what was happening on the secondary show. And that wasn't helped by the fact that network changes and, as a result, changes in the night in which the show aired frequently threw schedules into upheaval. Then, as if that weren't bad enough, SmackDown wrestlers starting to appear on Raw full-time basically turned the Blue Brand into little more than a recap show for what had been happening the prior Monday. Honestly, if the SmackDown 6 era had been the high point of the brand, then this was undoubtedly the low point, and the point where the show could have been canceled altogether and no one would have really batted an eye, as so few were bothering to even watch it on a regular basis anymore. Again though, this is not to say there was no reason to watch SmackDown at all during those dark days. No, whenever it was on the air, there were still glimmers of the old greatness it had, something which was evidenced in the run people like Jeff Hardy, Rey Mysterio, and Chris Jericho had as World Heavyweight Champion, or the latter days of The Undertaker's full-time schedule. Then of course there was the initial rise of Daniel Bryan with the big gold belt in 2011, or the Christian and Randy Orton feud that same year. Basically what we're saying here is there were still a few embers burning in that fire, even if the fire was almost burnt out completely. It's not like it ever dropped to the level of a Sunday Night Heat or anything. And that would be enough to see the show limp on to 2016, at which point it would get a second lease on life. What happened here? Well, with WWE deciding to reinstitute the brand extension, SmackDown suddenly had a purpose once more. That's right, going forward, it would once again have its own roster and its own titles, with the initial roster here managing to outshine the Raw one, just as it had done in the early 2000s. But then how could it not when it included people like Dean Ambrose, AJ Styles, John Cena, and Becky Lynch, just to name a few. Yes, it certainly helped the Blue Brand here that upon being moved over to Friday nights, it would be aired live again. But that wasn't the key factor in its fortunes turning around. No, the key factor was that it felt like it featured the best the main roster had to offer. After all, with Shane McMahon and Daniel Bryan, the two men running the show in kayfabe, being more motivated than ever to prove they could outdo what Stephanie McMahon and her rotating cast of general managers were doing over on Raw, they certainly weren't going to accept any less than the best, and that meant good times for fans watching. What were some of the highlights of this era of SmackDown? Well, the run of Dean Ambrose as WWE Champion might have had its low points, but at the very least, it established him as a guy who could be on that level, right there alongside his former Shield brothers Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins. And when it came time for AJ Styles' subsequent time on top, he was able to prove any doubters he ever had that he could carry a WWE brand on his shoulders. Sure, things like the Jinder Mahal reign were mistakes in hindsight, but they were balanced out by the initial rises of both Becky Lynch and Alexa Bliss in 2016, the Styles-Cena feud, the return of Daniel Bryan to the ring somewhat miraculously, and the work of others like Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn, and Bray Wyatt, all while they were arguably at their creative peaks. Even The Miz got something of a late career revival while part of the Blue brand here when, after going off on the American Dragon on an episode of Talking Smack, SmackDown's post-show hosted by Bryan and Renee Young, he suddenly found himself getting critical acclaim by many for the first time. Critical acclaim which would continue all the way into both his WrestleMania feud with John Cena and his partnership with Shane McMahon not long after this. Really, there was a sense here that the Friday show was truly the land of opportunity as it was being advertised, a more focused and character-driven piece of television where people could catch a break in opposition to the often illogical antics found over on Raw on Monday nights come the mid to late 2000s. And all this would lead to another peak for the Blue brand when, in 2018 and heading into 2019, it suddenly found itself home to the two top programs in the company. The birth of Becky Lynch's The Man character, and the surprise arrival of Kofi Mania heading into WrestleMania 35. How would they manage with this task? Very well as it happened because, once more, it felt like Friday nights was the place to watch your weekly fix of main roster WWE TV. Sure, it helped them to gain a bigger audience once they were moved over to Fox, with this being the biggest platform the company had been on in years at that point, a true major network which all but guaranteed a massive increase in viewership on a weekly basis. But even if that hadn't been the case, SmackDown still felt like the better show when compared to Raw here, something which was evident in the fact that so many of the big stars like Roman Reigns, found a permanent home there come the end of the decade. Really, you could argue that while there were plenty of times in the past where the Blue brand was outshining the Red one, this was the first time that WWE had truly treated it like the A show, something they clearly wanted to do on account of it now being on a better network than Raw was. And that would continue to be the case for the next few years. Unfortunately, though, there would be some rough years during this time period too, as we were about to enter into the dreaded era of the lockdown. Yes, it was in early 2020 that the world shut down for about a year and a half, and because of this, suddenly no fans were allowed in attendance at any sporting events. So this was when WWE introduced the Thunderdome, a giant video screen wall in which fans could tune in from home. Now, it wasn't ideal, but it was the best that the company felt they could do given the circumstances. And it would be something we'd all get used to very quickly as on both Raw and SmackDown, it soon became the norm. But while Raw was understandably struggling in the Thunderdome era, SmackDown did have an ace they were about to play in order to get fans interested again, in spite of the lack of atmosphere. And that ace would make its presence felt at SummerSlam of that year when Roman Reigns returned to the ring. Yes, after taking time away to look after his health during the beginnings of the lockdown, Roman returned at SummerSlam, now with an all-new heel demeanor and a new manager at his side in the form of Paul Heyman. This then was the birth of both the Tribal Chief and the Bloodline, the storyline which would dominate WWE TV for the next several years. And because Roman was a SmackDown exclusive, it meant the majority of this angle would play out on the Blue brand, with this only further solidifying the idea that it was the A show. That's right, the antics of Roman, Heyman, the Usos, Solo Sikoa, and for a very notable period, Sami Zayn, would all be something you could really only see on Friday nights. And that makes it ground zero when discussing the hot streak the company was about to undergo. Hell, so much was SmackDown the #1 focus for WWE here. Once Roman Reigns beat Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania 38 to unify both world titles and become undisputed WWE Universal Champion, he'd continue to mostly appear on SmackDown, meaning that if you wanted to see a world champion in WWE, you had to tune in on a Friday rather than a Monday. Obviously then, once crowds returned to arenas in mid-2021, this made the Blue brand the hottest ticket in comparison to Raw, and that would continue to be the case for the next couple of years as the Bloodline remained the nexus point which all WWE programming circled around. Drew McIntyre, CM Punk, Seth Rollins, Kevin Owens, Daniel Bryan, Edge, and of course Cody Rhodes. They all had some involvement with the Anoa'i family during this period, and that inevitably led them to SmackDown at points, even if this wasn't the show they'd been drafted to. But it wasn't just the Bloodline which was making SmackDown WWE's A show at the start of the 2020s. No, there was also the women's division, with this seeing previously featured players like Bianca Belair and Charlotte Flair getting to shine, all while newcomers to the main roster like Tiffany Stratton and Julia were also making a mark. Really then, it felt like it was the brand that had everything a WWE fan could want heading into the new decade. Of course, eventually the Roman Reigns world title run was going to have to end though, and when this happened, there were questions about how SmackDown would fare without such an all-encompassing angle driving it anymore, especially as by that time, the Tribal Chief was already a part-timer. But luckily, once the Bloodline fell at WrestleMania 40, an all-new champion would be crowned in Cody Rhodes. And with Cody Rhodes now being a SmackDown exclusive act as a result of this, it kept the blue brand on top in the internal brand war, as he was by that point very clearly the biggest star the company had. Hell, by the time 2024 came around, Cody was the biggest babyface WWE had seen since the peak days of John Cena. That said, today he's not being asked to carry the show by himself. No, folks like Roman Reigns still make semi-regular appearances, and with John Cena largely finding a home on the blue brand during his retirement year, it's only continued to solidify the importance of SmackDown in a post-Bloodline world. Sure, it might not be on Fox anymore, and with Raw now being on Netflix worldwide and SmackDown still being on cable TV in America, it means that the tides have shifted again in terms of what's considered the A show. But that doesn't make what takes place on Friday nights a B show. Rather, it's more of a 1A, the Dwayne Johnson to the red brand Steve Austin, if you will. But then, how could it be considered anything less? Really, CM Punk and Rhea Ripley aside, most of the big stars remain on SmackDown, even post-Netflix debut. And that's what's going to keep it a powerful brand within WWE for some time to come. Hell, we could even see a situation in the not-too-distant future where it becomes the full A show again, and once more proves that despite its humble beginnings as a mere extra 2 hours of programming every week, it's turned into so much more. Yes, the legacy of SmackDown today is something which could have gone no further than the pilot stage, but which turned into one of the biggest shows in wrestling history. It was a roll of the dice, but a roll of the dice which paid off big time for WWE. Sure, it's had its ups and downs like with any show, but even at its lowest point during the early 2010s when it was basically the Raw recap show, it was still valuable enough for Vince McMahon to keep it on the air. And when it's been at its strongest, like it was during the SmackDown 6 era or the Fox era, it's been the jewel in the company's crown, something which, even during dark times for WWE, has proven to be a shining light. It's a show which has had to adapt to much change, with it bouncing around various time slots, nights of the week, networks, and lockdowns over the course of this run, but that's just made it stronger as the brand has been forced to learn how to adapt and reinvent itself on a regular basis. So while Raw will always be considered the flagship of WWE, and while NXT had the cool factor from the black and gold days which made it the alternative brand of the promotion in many ways, SmackDown might quietly be the best of them all. If nothing else, it's shown itself multiple times over to be the fans' show, one which acts as the land of opportunity for stars who might not be able to get the same chances on a Raw, all while often serving as the more wrestling-centric brand, as it did particularly well during the early 2000s. All of this is to say, don't expect SmackDown to be going anywhere in the future. No, expect it to continue going from strength to strength, getting further rooted in the pop culture landscape each and every week as this new TKO era of WWE uses all its power to make the house that The Rock built something truly worthy of bearing his name.